unpacking this. So
Yeah.
in part one, we really started digging into this idea of white privilege and how it's not just about individual actions, but this whole system that's really embedded in our society.
Yeah, we talked about the history, those everyday examples, and even how this privilege can shape decisions in ways that people might not even realize.
Right. And, one of the things that really stuck with me was that concept of historical amnesia,
Mm.
which it seems really relevant when we're talking about this power dynamic involved in controlling the narrative, which is something you were talking about before.
Yeah, it's a crucial piece of the puzzle, right?
Mhm.
Because if we're not all working from the same understanding of what happened in the past, how can we create a future that's just and equitable?
Yeah. That's like trying to build a house on a foundation with all these cracks in it,
Yeah.
you know? You can try to patch things up, but eventually that whole structure is going to become unstable.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And Kendall argues that this historical amnesia is often a deliberate choice, a way for white people to create some distance from those uncomfortable truths about the past.
Hmm. So it's not just about forgetting facts and dates. It's about choosing to engage with history in a way that protects the status quo.
Exactly. And we see that in all sorts of things, from how history is taught in school to how certain events are celebrated or completely ignored.
Hey, you think about how often we celebrate people like George Washington without really acknowledging
Yeah.
that he was a slave owner, or how the genocide of Native Americans is often framed as like a necessary step
Mm,
in this westward expansion.
exactly. These kind of sanitized versions of history just serve to uphold white supremacy because they're erasing the voices and experiences of people who have been marginalized and oppressed.
And it creates this false narrative of progress that ignores how the past still affects us today.
Precisely. And Kendall argues that this control over the narrative is one of the most powerful ways that white privilege shows up.
Because it lets white people define what's considered normal, both historically and even in the present day.
Yeah. And anything that's different from that is often seen as, well, different or other or even threatening.
Like there's this unspoken rule book that dictates this is how things should be,
Mhm.
and anyone who doesn't fit into that is somehow wrong or out of place.
Exactly. And this sense of entitlement to define the narrative shows up everywhere, from the language we use to the way we represent certain groups in the media.
Like that example you gave about crime in the media.
Right. Black people are much more likely to be shown as criminals, while white people are more likely to be seen as the victims.
And that definitely reinforces harmful stereotypes and biases.
Absolutely. And it has very real consequences, leading to racial profiling and harsher sentencing.
So this control over the narrative isn't just some abstract thing. It has real impact.
Exactly. And Kendall argues that challenging this control is essential to dismantling white privilege.
So we need to be more critical of the information we take in and the stories we tell ourselves about the world.
Precisely. We have to be intentional about amplifying the voices and experiences of those who have been historically marginalized.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, controlling the narrative, and how. White privilege can shape how we see what's normal. But how does this work when it comes to, like, making decisions?
That's a great question, because as we've seen, white privilege often operates subconsciously.
Yeah. It's not always about intentional discrimination, but more about how our biases can shape our decisions.
Right. Kendall argues that white people often don't have to consider the needs and experiences of those who are different from them.
Because our own experiences are seen as the default.
Exactly. And that can lead to policies and practices that seem neutral but actually have a negative impact on marginalized groups.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Sure. Think about things like zoning laws that end up concentrating poverty in certain neighborhoods, or how education funding formulas can disadvantage schools in low-income areas.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's easy to see how those kinds of policies, even if they weren't designed to discriminate, would reinforce inequality.
Exactly. And Kendall says that we have to be more aware of these consequences and advocate for policies that promote equity and justice.
So it's not enough to just be aware of our own biases. We also need to change the systems that perpetuate them.
Absolutely. And that means challenging the way things are, speaking out against injustice, and supporting those who are working for a better world.
Okay, so far we've talked about how insidious white privilege can be, It's not always these big, obvious acts of discrimination, but these subtle advantages.
Right. And one of the most subtle but impactful is something Kendall calls whiteness as collateral.
I remember that phrase really stood out to me when I read the paper. What does that mean?
It's the idea that in our society, simply being white can be like a form of currency. It gives you access to resources and opportunities that people of color are often denied.
So it's like this invisible asset that you can cash in on without even realizing you have it.
Exactly. And it plays out in so many areas of life.
Like, give me some examples.
Things like getting approved for a loan, finding a place to live in a safe neighborhood, or even how you're treated by law enforcement.
Those are things that have a huge impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And these advantages aren't earned, they just come from being born into a system that values whiteness.
It's a stark reminder that things aren't as fair as we might like to think.
Right. And it shows how we need to dismantle these systems that create this inequality, not just address individual acts of discrimination.
Okay. So we've talked about the historical context, controlling the narrative, the way whiteness is normalized, and now whiteness as collateral.
Hmm.
That's a lot to take in.
It is. It can be hard to face these realities. But Kendall doesn't just leave us with this information. He also calls us to action.
Right. He's saying that it's not enough to just be aware of white privilege. We need to challenge it.
And that challenge starts with ourselves.
So what can we do? What are some concrete steps to move from awareness to action? We've spent this deep dive really getting into white privilege. We've talked about how it's part of our history, how it shows up in little things we might not even notice, and even how it's like this unearned advantage.
We've covered a lot, and it's pretty clear that this isn't about feeling guilty or anything like that. It's about understanding this bigger system we're all a part of.
Right. And so now I'm wondering, what do we do with this understanding? We can't just stop at awareness, right?
Yeah, definitely. Kendall makes it clear that knowing something but not doing anything about it is, well, kind of useless. His paper is all about going beyond just recognizing white privilege and actually doing something to change it, both within ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, so let's talk action. What can we actually do to dismantle this system? Or at least, how we take part in it?
Well, Kendall talks about shifting how we listen. It's about actively trying to hear and understand the experiences of people of color and not just waiting for those experiences to come to us.
So it's about making sure we're hearing from a variety of voices and perspectives.
Exactly. It means reading books and articles by authors of color, maybe listening to podcasts or watching documentaries that center those perspectives and having conversations with people whose lives are different from ours.
Yeah, I like that. It's like making a real effort to get outside of our own bubbles.
And to do it humbly, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. We're going to mess up sometimes, say the wrong thing, but that's all part of learning.
Yeah. It's about being open to being corrected and changing how we act based on what we learn.
Right. It's a process of unlearning and relearning all the time.
Kendall also mentions how important it is to speak up when we see injustice,
Yeah.
even when it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. That's a big one. Whether it's calling out a racist joke or challenging a policy at work or supporting groups that are fighting for racial justice, our voices matter.
And I think for those of us with white privilege, it's really important to use that privilege to make sure the voices of those who are marginalized are heard.
Absolutely. We can use our access and influence to make space for others to be heard and to challenge those in power who are, keeping these systems going.
This all sounds great, but I think some people might get stuck on the how, like where do you even begin?
I get that. It can feel overwhelming. But you don't have to be perfect right away. It's about taking those small steps.
Can you give us some examples of what those small steps might be?
Sure. It could be as simple as learning about a specific issue, donating to a group that's working on that issue, or just talking to a friend or family member about what you're learning.
Right. Even small things can have a big impact.
Yeah.
It's not about waiting for this perfect moment or some big gesture. It's about showing up and doing what you can with what you have.
Exactly. And connecting with other people who are doing this work too. Find a community so you don't feel alone.
Something that really resonated with me was how Kendall talks about this, not just as something we do on our own, but as this collective effort to change these systems.
Yeah, he talks about how individual actions are important, but they're not enough to change these structures that are so deeply rooted.
So we need to be thinking about things like changing policies, making sure resources are shared fairly, and holding our leaders accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to remember that these systems weren't created by accident, and they're not going to disappear by accident either. It takes real intentional work.
What about talking to people who maybe aren't aware of their privilege or don't even think it exists? Those conversations can be tough.
That's a tough one. I think approaching those conversations with empathy and a willingness to really hear the other person is key.
It's not about attacking them, but about helping them understand.
Exactly. But also remember that not everyone's ready to have these conversations. Sometimes all you can do is plant a seed.
Yeah, and sometimes you just need to set some boundaries to protect your own energy. We don't have to have every debate.
So important. It's okay to walk away from conversations that are draining or going nowhere.
I think it comes down to understanding that this work never really ends. It's not about reaching some perfect state. It's about constantly learning, growing, and pushing ourselves and others to do better.
I love that. It's a journey, not a destination.
And it's a journey that needs hope, even when things feel really hard.
Kendall reminds us that throughout history, movements for social justice have faced huge challenges and still made so much progress. We can learn from those who came before us and from those who are fighting alongside us now.
Yeah, we can choose to believe a better world is possible and then go out and work for it.
Exactly. That's what this work is all about: hope, action, and creating a more just world for everyone.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. We covered so much ground today, from the history of white privilege to concrete actions we can all take.
It's a complex issue for sure, but Kendall's work gives us the tools to understand it and a path forward.
I hope you take away from this deep dive that we all have a part to play in dismantling white privilege and building a better world.
It's not about being perfect, it's about showing up, doing the work, and never giving up hope.
So as you go about your day, think about the ways you can use what you've learned to make a difference.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a better future.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep diving.